oftentimes when we're having these conversations, sometimes it's helpful to start to look at different levers or different changes through the lens of a framework. So when we look from a data and research perspective, we find that belonging is really important to retention. And I mean, I can maybe count on one hand the number of times that I'm talking with an organization and they don't have a retention problem. So when we're thinking about keeping folks in the organization and keeping folks motivated and engaged, belonging is a really key and important aspect to driving that engaged and fully present workforce. When we look more largely at what are some of those capabilities at an organizational level of what drives those feelings of belonging, we can think about this in terms of 4 key factors and capabilities. So when we look at what we have on the screen, I promise not a lot of slides, just a 30-second run through so that we can see what we're all looking at here. Is if we start on the left, fairness perceptions. As we've talked about a lot of times, that some of these things sound really straightforward, but they aren't necessarily always as straightforward as we would hope. But having those perceptions of fairness really serve as a ceiling for how inclusive an organization can be and how much belonging is experienced. But it can also be a signaling mechanism for which groups are supported. And that's obviously something that we need to be paying attention to. So when we're looking at policies and practices as from a general fairness perspective, that can leave a little bit on the table because you also want to think about how your leaders are spending time developing and mentoring and providing that support, because those all can drive some of those fairness perceptions as well. Something else that we've talked about quite a bit is that oftentimes organizations will bring in diversity across every metric that we can think of, but they can't necessarily get them to stay. And what we often see is that's because they haven't necessarily taken a learning approach to building the organization. And that comes from an integration of differences. You can add all the differences in the world, but unless you take a learning approach and look at how the organization can support and sustain that learning, then you don't actually get that necessary integration. People don't feel as though they can show up authentically or bring themselves to work the way that you would hope. When we look at some of those more structural pieces, the first thing that I would talk about would be representation in decision making. So at an individual level, when we're talking to organizations, we often talk about whether or not folks feel as though they have an appropriate seat at the table. But at an organizational level, that can mean a lot of different things. Are you ensuring that all necessary stakeholders are engaged? How frequently are you updating that list of stakeholders? And what does that mean? When we're talking earlier about engaging different communities, do you have stakeholders from those communities giving feedback about the approach to how you're approaching those communities? That can be really important, and that's often overlooked at some of those higher levels. So just having that conscious thought about what stakeholder engagement actually means moving forward. And then the last piece that we think about from an organizational level would be involvement. So something that we do is look at this through actual connectivity and collaboration. And when you look at how people are connecting and communicating, that's how you're actually seeing how work is getting done. So you could have a very diverse organization spanning all different types of demographic makeup. But if you take a deeper dive, you could just have a lot of small homogeneous groups within that diverse organization. So looking at how folks are connecting and collaborating through network analysis, through actual metrics that can look at how work is being done, can be a really good way to understand what immersion can look like and feel like within an organization. But these are some of those high-level things that organizations can think about and discuss when it comes to approaching driving belonging. But Naima, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the conversations that you have with leaders when you're talking specifically to leaders about boosting some of those feelings of belonging.
Absolutely. And I am privileged to speak to a lot of leaders about this. And we've had some really robust conversations on what they can do. And I often tell leaders it really starts with them, right? And the practices that they project around having a diverse workforce and making them feel that sense of belonging, that will further cascade to their subsequent leaders, and they'll practice as well. One thing I love to tell them is find out what motivates your people, right? What motivates them, and make sure that you are creating opportunities and spaces where possible to maximize that. The more you pour into your people, the more you will get back from them. It's really a basic concept. And if people feel as though they are a part of an organization that celebrates them and is giving them opportunities to prosper, that will certainly eliminate a lot of the retention that we see. You'll be able to retain folks. I'll, really match the energy, right? And make it a mutually beneficial relationship. I encourage leaders to make sure that they're having regular check-ins, right? So if you are in the C-suite, make sure that you're having that next layer, the folks that report to you, you're having regular check-ins with them. Set that example so that they then will have those regular check-ins with the folks that report to them. And then you have created this ecosystem where you are providing feedback, and it's also reciprocated. Ask for feedback, ask what you could be doing better as a leader as well, so that it doesn't come across as though I'm just telling you what you need to do. No one's perfect, right? Especially leaders. I think everyone could admit that you're an imperfect leader, and it's being transparent and being vulnerable, and having your folks realize that you don't know it all, right? I didn't get here by myself. And you will create that ecosystem where it's happening and those conversations are happening, and there isn't that huge disparity. A lot of times when I enter an engagement at the individual contributor level and at the C-suite, there's a huge disconnect that CEO thinks everything is great. Oh, we're doing great. We have lots of diversity, but it's all at the very lowest runs of the organization, right? And those folks are actually not very happy. They're miserable. So a lot of times when I am engaging, I'm bridging that gap, and it's because those conversations aren't happening. So again, pouring into your folks and foster that belonging within your organization.